Hello and welcome to the third segment of Elements of Preservation. This series of webinars marks the beginning of the Finding Common Ground, the collaborative training of the Cultural Heritage and Emergency Response Communities project. The Finding Common Ground project is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and is administered by the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners and supported by our partners, COSTEP Mass, the Massachusetts Archives, the New England Museum Association, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and the Massachusetts Department of Fire Services. The Elements of Preservation consists of a series of recorded webinars that will help all participants to come to the first in-person workshop at the same level. If you have any questions when progressing through these recordings, please don't hesitate to contact me, Danya Khan, your instructor. So today we're going to be talking about collection, storage, and handling. And when we talk about collection, storage, and handling, we really want to be thinking about not only our storage furniture and our storage space, but also the materials that are housing our collections. And poor quality enclosures, or the lack thereof, can really damage collections both physically and chemically. Chemical damage such as yellowing, discoloration, or embrittlement can result from direct contact with acidic storage containers or volatile organic compounds produced by poor quality storage materials. Physical damage can result when those enclosures are either too small or too large, the wrong shape, or if no enclosures are used at all. So when choosing enclosures, it's important to understand the terminology used to describe their component materials. And to be aware of which enclosures are appropriate for which collections. So this is where we come to the question of just what is archival. And terms such as archival and acid-free are frequently encountered in the catalogs that we look at, but they're ambiguous terms. There's really no standards governing the use of these terms, and they're sometimes misused, so really read the supplier's catalogs carefully. If you have questions about a product, ask the supplier for details. If they can't give you an adequate response, find another supplier because you just can't trust the materials that they're selling you. And it's our money, and we want to make sure that we're using it wisely. And don't assume that just because a product is included in a specific preservation supply catalog that it really is the best preservation choice. So the word archival is not measurable. It implies materials that would be chemically stable and suitable for long-term storage, but if there's no other description given other than just the word archival, you really need to ask. And so what you want to find out is whether any of your paper goods are acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered. So acid-free or acid-neutral enclosures have a pH of 7 to 7.5 at the time of manufacture and will absorb a limited amount of acids before they themselves become acidic and begin to decay. Materials that are lignin-free have gone through a process to remove the lignin from the paper or are produced from cotton or linen. And lignin is a very unstable component in our papers, most commonly found in newsprint, and why newsprint goes acidic so quickly. So we want to look for lignin-free materials so that we can better protect our collections. And finally, for most of our collections, with the exception of cyanotypes and blueprints, as well as woolen or silk materials, we want to look for buffered enclosures that contain some sort of alkaline substance, which raises the pH to 8.5 or higher, and this means that those storage materials can absorb more damaging materials, both from the artifact that they're holding, but also from the air, to really create a more protective environment. If you're working with photographs, be sure that anything passes the photographic activity test or the PAT. And this is a specific test to determine the suitability of enclosures for photographic materials, which have very special criteria. So what you should look for in terms of your storage materials. For paper-based enclosures, we want to use chemically stable, acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered enclosures that will actively reduce the sources of acid damage. We want to avoid papers or folders or boxes that are not acid-free. And if you're not sure and you have a lot of legacy materials, you can purchase a pH marking pen to easily check to see if they are alkaline or if they have become acidic. We want to avoid glassine, either in the envelope form or in sheet form. Glassine becomes acidic over time. And they are now making some acid-free glassine, but it really hasn't passed the test of time yet to see if it's truly stable, and so I still hesitate to recommend it. Any of the brown craft paper envelopes that you would find in older collections, and then any newsprint or any unstable wood pulp products. We really want to be sure to avoid those. If you're looking at plastics, plastics are petroleum products, and many of them release plasticizers. Plasticizers are added to the plastic to give it the characteristics that the manufacturers want, and a lot of these will come out and be very damaging to our collections. So plastics used for storage enclosures really should be made of polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene, and they are generally safe for both storing paper and photographic collections. You can get also you can get the boxes that are, I believe, polypropylene, if I remember correctly, from the preservation suppliers, and those are stable as well. So if you're in a place where you get drips a lot, but your humidity is rather under control, those might be a good option. So looking at plastic sleeves, make sure they're polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene with no coatings. So avoid the ones with anti-static coatings because they can be problematic. But they're a great way to allow for access to paper and photographic materials while they can remain protected within their plastic enclosure. So also try to avoid enclosures that would be in direct contact with collections that have UV inhibitors because, again, any of those sorts of additions may be damaging to the collections. We want to always avoid any polyvinyl chloride or PVC materials and any unidentified plastics, including grocery bags, garbage bags, dry cleaning bags, saran wrap, etc. One of the rules of thumb that I like to share with people is basically if you can smell the plastic, don't use it because that really means you've got volatile organic compounds being given off, and if you can smell them, that it's a really high level of off-gassing, so you want to avoid them. Also, in general, we're going to avoid using any sort of pressure-sensitive tapes and preferably pressure-sensitive labels, especially on our collections. We're going to avoid rubber bands. They get really sticky as they degrade and will stick to your collections. We're going to avoid paper clips if at all possible. The only kind that I would recommend are the stainless steel paper clips that you can get. Otherwise, they run the risk of corrosion as well as deformation. The plastic clips really damage collections as well. Post-it notes are a definite no-no. They leave residual adhesive and can also bleed if they're in a water incident. And then any sort of standard glue or glue sticks. Acid-free glue sticks have recently appeared on the market, but they really should be avoided because any of the glue sticks, the adhesive dries out and your materials will fall off over time, and it's actually a very short period of time. So going to a much larger scale, we want to look at our storage areas and where are we storing our materials. So we've talked a bit in the environment section about avoiding basements and attics because of the dampness and the temperature swings that we can get, but also air circulation should be really good. Remember, we talked about that with our mold, because we don't want those damp, stagnant pockets of air. So, we want to look for that. And so we want places that will allow for easy access and safe movement of collections. So if you're in a really cluttered space, it's not going to be safe to move the collections around, and nor is it going to be safe for you to try to move around either. We want to make sure that we have good shelving that will support the weight of our collections, but also that will keep collections at least 3 inches or 4 inches away from exterior walls, especially if you're in a basement, as well as keep collections sufficiently off the floor. And I like to give about a 4 inches off the floor there as well, to provide air circulation to prevent damage from rising damp. And also a lot of our floods don't get that deep, and so it would save you from a lot of the small floods that we would get. And you really want to think about meeting the needs of special formats. So if you've got audio tapes, videotapes, motion picture film, you want to make sure you're getting shelving that accommodates those boxes as well. Also, if you're using closed cabinets, especially if you've got fireproof cabinets, you want to be opening the doors and the drawers on a regular basis. Just again, because of those stagnant pockets of air, it will allow the air to circulate and disturb that mold to prevent it from starting to grow again. We also want to look at our storage furniture. We really want to think about both our freestanding and compact shelving if we have it. So selection of storage furniture is not something that all of us will be able to do in our careers. Most of us will just inherit existing storage furniture, but you do need to know about the different sorts of storage furniture that you have. And if you are looking for new, we're going to be looking for storage furniture that does not off-gas, does not have any sort of abrasive surface or projecting ridge, is of adequate size for the collections we're going to store on it, and give adequate support. So the ideal storage furniture is powder-coated steel. It's our most common new option and one of the best options available. The powder coatings really cover the steel, so there isn't a problem with the steel rusting, and they don't off-gas anything. You can also get baked enamel storage units. They're also, for the most part, really safe. There have been some baked enamel materials where the enamel wasn't baked enough, and they do give off formaldehyde and other volatile organic compounds. So you need to really look into the reputation of the furniture manufacturer. So again, it's a good option, but use it with your own due diligence. You can also get the open chrome-plated steel shelving. And for these, you want to make sure that they're not going to be housing anything that's not already in a box, because you can transfer those patterns to your collection items. And you also want to make sure that you are actually getting shelving that has enough strength to support the weight of the collections that you're putting on it. And most of the vendors will let you know what the shelf rating is, and so how much weight those shelves can hold. So a lot of us have probably inherited, as you can see in the picture here, wooden storage. Wood has traditionally been very popular, especially in public areas of libraries, because of the aesthetics and the ease of construction. Wood does emit acetic acid, formaldehyde, as well as some other acids, and we really just want to be cautious. The older the wood is, generally the safer it will be, but we just want to be sure that we know the age of our shelving and take certain precautions. So What we want to avoid, if we can, in terms of new wood is oak. We've talked about that before. It really is the worst of the woods. And then our wood composites are plywood and our MDF. Many are advertised as formaldehyde-free, but they do have other damaging potential acids and volatile organic compounds in them beyond the formaldehyde. So if you do have wooden storage furniture already in use, you can take safeguards. Ideally, the wood would be sealed or covered with a vapor barrier, which would prevent any transfer of volatile organic compounds. You can get water-based polyurethane, which does a really good job. Be sure you read the container to know how long this needs to cure before you can put anything back on it. Oil-based polyurethanes should be avoided because they take a lot longer to really cure, and they in and of themselves have a lot more volatile organic compounds. Paints can be used to seal wood. Again, an acrylic latex paint forms a less effective barrier than the polyurethane, but it's quite often easier to use. Again, read the can, know how long it takes to completely cure, and trust them, because if you put your books back on your shelves and they're not quite cured, you will have books with paint on their bottoms. And I know this from personal experience and being less than patient in wanting to put my books back on my bookshelves. So please learn from my mistakes. We want to avoid, of course, any oil-based paints, again, because of the oil-based paints would have a lot of the volatile organic compounds. You can also, if aesthetics aren't an issue, you can line the wood with Marvel Seal, which is a true vapor barrier, but it is a metallic laminate, and so it would look like you have tinfoil on your shelves, so it's not exactly for shelves that would be in open public areas. You can also line the shelves with polyester sheeting, so a Mylar or a Melanex, or you can use corrugated acid-free, lignin-free buffered board or mat board, but that does start to become more costly. So it's all a question of balancing the need to protect the collections and also your budget. Finally, in thinking of storage furniture, this is kind of where I talk about carts. We want to make sure that you have carts for moving large collection items around. Be sure the carts themselves are strong and stable, that you don't have any wonky wheels, and always be sure that you are moving collections with the proper support. I can't remember, this is somewhere in East Asia, and they're moving a stuffed elephant, and obviously didn't have a proper cart to move him on, so he's going up the middle of the escalator, and I am sure it was quite the exciting, quite the fun project to watch happening. I still feel bad for the poor elephant. So those are the sorts of things that you want to look for, but finally, you really want to look for storage furniture that has smooth, non-abrasive finishes, because you are putting collections on and taking them off, and that does create some friction. Again, free of projection, ridges, obstructions, or sharp edges, and this includes doorknobs that may be adjacent to your collections, and so things aren't going to be bumping into them. And then you want to make sure that you don't have any finishes or lubricants that might off-gas. We just talked about that. But also make sure that your shelving is bolted to itself as well as to the wall. And this is because we may be in Massachusetts. We're not a big earthquake zone, but we are in an earthquake zone. And so you want to make sure that that shelving is supported and isn't going to topple over, causing injury to people and damage to your collections. And also really make sure when you can that your shelving is of the appropriate depth for your collections. It's really easy to have really narrow shelves and really large books so that when somebody takes a book off the shelf, other books fall down around it, and that can be really dangerous, not only for your patrons but also for the collections. So just some general guidelines to think about. Also, if you have books sticking out too far into aisles, if you do have, or oversized items, boxes, anything sticking out too far into aisles, people coming through with carts could bump into things. So you just really want to be careful. So we're going to go through now some quick tips for safe storage of different items. This is not going to be an exhaustive list, but it's going to give you some of the very general best practices that you can do for your collections. So for bound volumes, you want to, of course, make sure you've got the adequate shelving, that it's deep enough and that it's strong enough to hold the books, and books are really heavy. Regular-sized books, your octavos, should be shelved upright, and as well as you can, shelve volumes of like size together so that you don't have really large books and really small books together, because then when you do go through those changes in relative humidity, you can get the deformation of the bindings. We want to make sure our books don't lean. That can cause damage to the binding, so we want to always use bookends. We really prefer the non-knifing bookends, which in the image on the top here, the non-knifing bookend is the one on the right. The knifing bookend is the one on the left. Again, if your budget doesn't allow it, at least as long as you have bookends of this nature and not the little wire W-shaped ones that fit into some of the more modern shelving, you'll be doing good. If books are too tall to store upright, don't store them on their foredge, store them on the spine. I know a lot of institutions store their books on the foredge so people can still see the call number, but it's really bad for the binding in large books, and so you'll get more life if you turn the book spine down and move the call number maybe to the bottom corner of the books. For books that are really large, your folios and your double folios, those you want to store horizontally, and you really want to stack them no more than 2 to 3 volumes deep. And as somebody who has worked in special collections and had to retrieve oversized books that were in stacks more akin to the picture on the bottom here, I can tell you that it's a lot of work and a lot of planning to get to that book on the bottom. You need to have a cart for the books that will be coming off. You need a cart for the book that will be going. And quite often it's really difficult to maneuver with all of these materials, and you do wind up bumping into things, and you can cause damage. For scrapbooks, which are a real problem for a lot of us, we know that our scrapbooks are problematic due to variations not only in the structure, but also in the content. You never know what's going to show up in a scrapbook. Ideally, if the scrapbooks are stable, we will store scrapbooks vertically on a shelf just as we would any other book. But for scrapbooks that are damaged and really fragile or have a lot of loose items, then you want to think about individually storing scrapbooks in custom fitted boxes horizontally. And this is going to be especially true for those which have historic value as the artifact as a whole and not just for the information that is on each individual page. These boxes can be purchased economically from a variety of vendors, and so you just find the one that you work with most comfortably. You send them the dimensions and they send you a flat box. You fold it up and hey presto, you have a custom box for your scrapbooks. For scrapbooks that are very damaged and don't have value as an artifact in and of themselves, but have importance for the information that are on the page, each page can be individually numbered, put into folders and then boxed as you would any archival collection. And so you can see in the bottom image here a project that's been going on to basically transfer the scrapbooks that you see on the right into individual pages, into folders, and in the boxes that you see on the left. And so good options for protecting scrapbooks as well as the information that's in them. Manuscripts and other bound documents, unbound documents, sorry, are vulnerable to damage from inappropriate storage on many levels because our paper in many of these collections is brittle. And so we want to follow some really basic practices that many of us already know, including foldering and boxing with chemically stable materials, removing any corroded fasteners, trying to store materials by size and type when possible, and encouraging safe handling practices. So we really want to be sure that we're using acid-free, lignin-free buffered file folders at a minimum. Ideally, we'd also be using acid-free, lignin-free buffered boxes, so we can add another really good layer of protection. When the paper that we're using is stable, several sheets can be stored in one folder, accommodating the thickness by creasing at the bottom of the folder. So generally, I look at it and I go about 20 pages per folder would be ideal if the paper is stable. If the paper is fragile, I only go about 5 sheets per folder, or I use individual sleeves for those items. It depends on just how brittle and what the items are. We want to make sure that when we put the folders into the boxes, that the box itself is not overcrowded. And if we've got boxes that aren't full, that we are supporting those folders so that they don't slump. If you allow the folders to slump, it's like when your mother said, don't slouch like that, you'll stick that way. Well, the papers will just get a definite deformation, and they will remember that shape and stay in that shape. So we really encourage using spacers. So you can see an example of a spacer in the bottom image here. That helps to keep all of those folders nice and upright. So if you've got items that are folded, ideally they would be stored unfolded, but only if it can be done without splitting or fracturing the item. So if an item resists unfolding, or if it would result in damage, it might require humidification and flattening, at which point you would want to contact a conservation professional who could help you with how to do that. If you have letters, they should be stored with their corresponding envelopes. Ideally, we want to store, as I said earlier, objects of the same size and category together. This would mean photographs would be stored with photographs, paper would be stored with paper, bound objects would be stored with bound objects, and you would store according to size. And so if you've got things that go larger than your document boxes, you would store them in the gallery boxes with folders that are the same size as the box and not necessarily the item. And we just really want to watch out for certain items that can cause damage. For example, if you have architectural drawings that are diazotypes, they were a chemical process. They continue to off-gas for many, many, many years, and they can be very damaging to other collections stored in the same folder or even the same drawer as them. So there will be certain items that you want to separate out because they would be damaging to others in the boxes. Works of art on paper are very vulnerable to damage from inappropriate storage and handling practices, in many ways similar to that of our paper documents. For us, Old Master prints, although they may be some of the oldest items in our collection, are probably the most stable because of the rag type paper that they were printed on. But our more modern prints and drawings are going to have a lot of the same problems that our acidic papers have, because they are on acidic papers. So As with anything, we want to protect these items during storage, and that includes foldering with acid-free, lignin-free buffered folders, where the folders are the size of the box or the drawer that you're storing the items in and not the size of the item. It's good for the folder to be larger because if any shifting occurs, if your folders are the size of the item and not the size of the box or the drawer, they can shift over time, come out of their folder, and really be damaged. You can actually mount and mat your items and store them in a box that way. Mat board and folders, whichever you're using, should be rigid enough to support the item when moving. If you've got sensitive media, so pastels, charcoals, some really heavy graphite drawings, or any other friable media, matting is really the best because that gives you a protective layer between items. And again, storing by size and making sure that the folder or the mat is the size of the box rather than specific to the size of the item. Again, with that shifting issue we want to avoid. You can sleeve in polyester, but don't put any sort of pastel, pencil, charcoal, or any other friable media into polyester sleeves or any plastic sleeves. They have a element of static, and that would be really damaging to the item. And finally, if you have oversized works of art on paper, again, large boxes or flat file drawers, really only roll works of art as an absolute positive last result. It should be, there is no other way humanly possible to do it, and so it really should be your last resort. For works of art of paper on display, of course, we want to limit the light, and we want to use our UV blocking glazing and really control that lighting like we talked about earlier. And when handling any of our works of art, we want to use clean, dry hands, no gloves. Gloves can catch on things and smear things and reduce the tactile sense in our hands, so we can actually do more damage than we do good by wearing gloves. So clean, dry hands on a clean, flat surface, no food or drinks. Paintings and framed items, so this could be framed works of art on paper as well. Of course, want to be stored in a stable environment because, as we were talking about before, paintings are composite items, and so when the humidity is shifting a lot and your canvas is expanding and contracting, the oil paints and the gesso that's on that canvas aren't moving, and so you start to get a lot of damage to the image surface because the canvas is moving and the actual paint is not. So we want to be sure we're storing those in very stable environments. We want to make sure that we are protecting not only the face of the artwork, but we are protecting the back. So we want to use backing boards on our frames, and that's going to prevent punctures from coming through on the back. We want to be sure that when we are displaying our paintings that they are not on any exterior walls or over fireplaces or radiators. Fireplaces and exterior walls are areas that would have the greatest environmental change, so both temperature and relative humidity, and so it can happen that you will get a mold bloom on the back side of your painting that you don't know about because it's been going through all of these micro environmental changes that we just don't see. And if you store them over fireplaces and radiators, you're going to start to get rapid changes in temperature, which would be damaging. So when we're storing paintings when they're not on display, we want to be sure that they are being stored vertically and preferably hanging. We don't want to store our framed items just in stacks on the floor because that opens them up to problems from pests, from accidental kicking or bumping into. It may also cause problems if your housekeeping comes around and mops around them or vacuums around them, or who knows what. So there are a lot of really low-cost options for hanging storage, but you can also do some really low-cost options for frame shelving. And so you would have shelving that would be tall enough to accommodate the frames, support the frames, and that would have a padded bottom so that when the frame is resting on the shelf, it's resting on something soft, so either a Volara or a foam core or something. And as you can see in the image here on the left, now that we have all these digital cameras, it's a really great way to make it easier to find the paintings by putting the image of the painting onto the spacer board. So you would also want to, if you have multiple frames in one bin, you want to have foam core or cardboard between each frame to prevent the frames from poking each other and causing damage. So anything that you can do to reduce the mechanical damage to your paintings while in storage are what you want to do. Textiles, we want to be sure that we're storing our textiles in similar environments to books and paper. That's because a lot of our materials that we find in books and paper are also the same that we find in our textiles. For smaller textiles and costumes or clothing, we want to box those if we can. That's going to protect them from light and dust. For really large items, sometimes we want to save space by rolling. It's not the ideal. Even with quilts, we still want to fold them and box them. But if you do need to roll them, again, you're going to roll them and then cover that. So again, it's protected from dust and light. If you're putting items into a box, you're going to pad all of the folds with tissue so that you don't get really hard creases. And if you're rolling, you're actually going to roll the item. You're going to put, for example, the quilt, you'd put the quilt face down on the table and roll it so that it's face out. And that's because when you roll and everything is kind of bending, you're at least putting the bends and the creases on the back side of the quilt and not on the front. And again, you would interleave with tissue as you were right at the very end when you were rolling, and then right at the very beginning to protect the quilt from the tube. You will always inspect your textile collections regularly for insects, and this is where having them boxed really helps. It's easy to see the frass and the carcasses in the box. If you're going to hang your clothing, make sure you use very well padded hangers so that there is a lot of support, and never hang clothing that is really fragile or extremely heavy so that you don't do damage to that shoulder area. And then again, as with most of our collections, we're going to limit light exposure and not keep items on display longer than they should be. For oversized items, we're looking at maps or posters, large prints, all sorts of different things. There are a lot of options that we can have. Acid-free folders and flat file drawers or appropriate sized boxes would be the preferred. They're easier to use and they cause less deformation. We can do rolled storage, but we would avoid rolling our items and storing them like we have on the upper left here, but rather we would store them, as you can see, in the upper right. And that would be on 3 to 4 inch tubes and then covered and tied to protect the items from light and dust. And then the larger tube means that you don't have attack curled items when you go to actually use them. And again, ideally, we're going to be using acid-free, lignin-free buffered folders and boxes and tubes, and really protecting our collections from light and dust. And if you are using banks of flat files, be sure that you keep those, at least some flat file tops, clear for transferring and viewing items, because we have multiple folders in drawers. And again, if you need to get to that bottom folder, you need to be able to move things around so that you can safely get materials out. For photographs, you want to make sure that any materials that you are using have passed the photoactivity test. If it hasn't passed the photoactivity test, that doesn't mean it will be bad for your collections. It just means you need to ask. Photos, both prints and negatives, should be stored individually in folders or polyester sleeves, ideally. And again, we really want to make sure when we are looking at our photographs and our photographic negatives that we are wearing nitrile or plain cotton gloves so that we don't transfer our finger oils. And it's really important for us to have an idea of what type of photographic process we have, because the different photographic processes will have different needs in terms of their care. But also we need to know what sort of photographic film we have, because cellulose nitrate film deteriorates very quickly and can be a hazard, and we'll talk about that more when we get to our disaster planning and risk assessment sections. But cellulose acetate also deteriorates very quickly and gives off acetic acid as it deteriorates, which is why we call it vinegar syndrome, and can be damaging to any collections around it. So it's important to know not only how to store them, but also what types of materials that you're dealing with in terms of your photographs. Motion picture film is in many ways like photographic film. Again, if film is cellulose nitrate, we want to be very careful. If we have a small number of rolls, it's safe to store them in fireproof cabinets. Ideally, if you have several, cellulose nitrate films, you'd have a specialty storage vault. If you don't have the space for a specialty storage vault, I would try to find an institution that takes in other people's collections. Otherwise, your cellulose nitrate is a prime candidate for reformatting. Motion picture films will be stored horizontally with the films wrapped around a solid core. And this is to prevent too much weight on certain parts of the film. So if you stored them vertically, you would have all of the weight on the film going onto a very small area of the film, and it can be very damaging. So if you store it horizontally, you distribute that weight, you distribute the stress, and it's much safer for the film. If you have film that has sound, especially older motion picture films, you want to store it tails out, just like we would for audio, to prevent sound bleed through. So for various and sundry media, we want to protect the materials from dust by keeping them in acid-free or polypropylene or polyethylene containers. You can get acid-free boxes in both paper and plastic for reel-to-reel audio. You can get stable plastic containers for cassette tapes and DVDs and things of that nature. Again, like I had just mentioned, for our audio tapes, especially the reel-to-reel audios, we want to store those tails out because there is some sound bleed through over time, and echoes are easier to ignore than the ghostly pre-voices. We want to make sure our magnetic media, like our reel-to-reel audio, are stored vertically. And that's because they can hang on the core and it's safer for them that way. Our vinyl records want to be stored vertically because, again, too much weight, if you store them horizontally in a big pile, the albums on the bottom are going to be taking on a lot of excess weight, and so we want to store them vertically to distribute that weight. We want to make sure that we make copies and keep our originals in cold storage because a lot of the media is actually becoming obsolete. So very few institutions have reel-to-reel players that actually work and are safe to use. So we want to make sure that we aren't losing that information, so we want to reformat whenever we can. We're going to store any of those reformatted duplicates in different locations to make sure that if something happens in one place, we don't lose our only copies. And we really want to watch out for equipment obsolescence. So even CDs now are becoming obsolete. There are many computers that don't have CD or DVD drives anymore. So we really just want to be aware. And as a final note, don't use Post-it notes on CDs or DVDs. As you can see from the bottom image, this is what will happen. So be very careful. And if you think Post-it notes really don't have that strong of tack, this is what can happen. Digital files, of course, are ubiquitous now, and we do want to think about how we are storing them. So at the most basic level, the bit level, which is passive preservation, we're going to store them in multiple locations on multiple media. We are going to refresh the documents or digital objects whenever we can. We're going to migrate them whenever there's a hardware or software upgrade to make sure that we keep up with the versions. And we're going to, if we can, preserve the technology. And not all of us are going to have the space to do that. But for those who do, preserving the technology, so preserving those old computers with the old software could be a passive way to go about it. There are active ways to go about digital preservation through emulation and normalization. This starts to require more expertise within your staff. And then going to a full life cycle management and full true digital preservation requires even more training beyond that, as well as the equipment and the budgets within the institution. So for most of us in our smaller institutions, as long as we think about the bit level preservation and having multiple copies on multiple media in multiple locations, that may be the best we can do. And it will be good enough until we can take the next step and start to go with a more active preservation system. So some final thoughts for the end of this segment. We want to remember for any of our materials, especially books and papers and photographs, textiles, anything that's going to go into a box. We want those enclosures to be durable and chemically stable. So they're going to be acid-free, lignin-free, and either buffered or unbuffered depending on the needs of the item. Remember, buffered for anything plant-based, unbuffered for anything animal-based like silks or wools, but then also anything cyanotype or blueprint, anything in that family. Enclosures should fit the items and provide support. So your boxes should fit the item, but then any folder should fit the box. You want to identify any materials in your collections that are stored in deteriorating or damaged enclosures and replace those on a regular basis. And again, we're going to avoid tape and rubber bands and paper clips and Post-it notes and glue sticks. So thank you for joining me on this third section of the elements of preservation. And we will be moving on to security and building maintenance next. Thank you and have a good day.